Hello, everybody. Welcome back to class. This is the second time I'm recording this video because in the first recording, one of my dogs jumped up on the desk and I spent about 5 minutes trying to get her down. And I thought, well, in the name of being professional, I would just re-record. So what we're going to do today is, well, let's get into it. Let's start the PowerPoint first. And I'm still not sharing my screen yet. Oh boy. I'm not great at technology. I don't know if you've figured that out yet. Share screen. Okay. Now let's get into our PowerPoint. Okay, so welcome once again to what was my fake class this time? Oh, Philosophy 2021, Death in American Culture. Does Frosty the Snowman teach us how to die? That, of course, would be a ridiculous class. Nobody's taking that one. This is Ethics and Science. And for this third lecture, what we're going to do is first, I want to talk about Dr. King's letter from Birmingham jail, which we did not address in the last lecture because we kind of got a little too close to time. And then after that, what we're going to do is try and apply our three ethical systems so that we can explore them a little better. What I'm going to do is I'm going to throw three fictional scenarios onto the screen and explore how each ethical system we have, in our textbook might apply to each one, how each framework might look at the question that we're posing there. Afterwards, your discussion post, and I'll have more details for you at the end, is going to be your own way of looking at any one of those three questions. I'm going to ask you to pick one, explain what you would do, and then name the ethical frameworks you are working in for your decision making. So let's get down to it, starting with the letter from Birmingham jail. What I want to point out here is that we might say that this is a work of moral genius. And I don't want to pull it apart and, into its smallest parts. Descartes has his thing about you can only understand something by breaking it into its smallest pieces and building it back together. And I don't really like that way of doing philosophy. I think it's not super helpful. In some ways, it also kind of does violence to whatever you're looking at. And I don't want to do that to Dr. King. And what does he do here? Well, let me give you some context first, actually. So this is something he wrote when he was jailed during his protests that he helped organize in Birmingham, Alabama, which was a pretty violent time. Dr. King and his friends were obviously nonviolent. They were pacifists. Dr. King wrote whole books about pacifism, but they were being treated quite violently by the police, with more brutality than they were met anywhere else. And so when he was in jail, he wrote this piece as a way of calling out a lot of the clergy in the city of Birmingham and across the country, saying, look, I mean, you guys believe in a lot of stuff that you're not practicing here. Why are you not joining us if our cause is just? And the way he does that is he actually works in all three of our different moral frameworks here. Again, guy's a moral genius. So first he points to virtue ethics. He names these virtues of individuals, of states, of countries, communities, of religions, and shows that these things aren't being lived up to. First one, what are some of the virtues he points to? Well, there's freedom and equality and justice. He doesn't, go out of his way to list long lists of virtues because that's not really what he's aiming for here. But he is pointing to virtues that have not been practiced on the part of powerful people, and virtues that he would say have not been allowed to be practiced on the part of others. He also points to a lot of ethical imperatives. And where does he get those? Well, Dr. King is himself a religious man. He's a reverend, and the people he's writing to are clergy. And so where does he point? He points to God. If you want, a concrete set of ethics, based on moral imperatives, religion is a place to find that. And what he says is, look, these members of clergy that I'm writing to, you have failed to hold up your end of the deal. You are not living up to your moral imperatives. To be considered a moderate in a time of injustice is to be on the side of injustice. And your moral responsibilities should cause you to violate your legal responsibilities, because we have a responsibility to resist unjust laws. I mentioned it in the other video. There's kind of this punk rock quality to certain forms of deontology, and I think that's on full display here, which is that, the people who are considered authorities have less authority than whatever our imperatives are, whatever our moral obligations are. He also makes a very interesting argument from consequentialism. He says that many people have praised the Birmingham police force for showing discipline and restraint in the way that they have acted with protesters. But you're only seeing part of the story. You're not seeing how brutally people are treated when the newspapers aren't there. And actually, in his book, Why We Can't Wait, which is about the Birmingham campaign, he shows a lot of pictures, and those police officers were not kind to Dr. King and his friends. They were treated with excessive force on every occasion. So he's saying, look, they're not acting morally. They might look like they're acting morally, but this police force is using the appearance of morality for immoral ends. And that's a consequentialist argument. To say that the end to which they are working, even though they might, to whatever newspaper is reporting, appear to be ethical people, they are working for an ethic of injustice. And so what they are doing is wrong. They are beating nonviolent protesters. And these folks who are nonviolent are pushing for what? They're pushing for these virtues of freedom, equality, justice, to be recognized as fully human. And can there be any greater moral obligation than to recognize our neighbor, as human? So I wanted to show you that. I would hope that if you have the time, you would actually look into some of Dr. King's books because, like I said up here, the guy's a moral genius. There's nobody else in American history that I think presents arguments quite so well. If you're curious, I would recommend his book Stride Toward Freedom, which was about his Montgomery bus boycott. It was kind of where the movement that Dr. King was a part of got its start. Moving on, let's talk about our hypothetical questions. And again, we're going to do 3 of them. We're going to talk about how we might approach them in terms of virtue ethics, deontology, and consequentialism. And where I can, I might also want to point out how care ethics could apply. So let's start with number 1. Let's say, hypothetically speaking, that you live under a totalitarian government and you are sheltering someone who has been unjustly declared to be an enemy of the state. I don't want to go into any specifics about which government or why they're an enemy of the state. That doesn't matter here. What does matter is that you have another friend who is being questioned about the location of the person you're sheltering. And your friend's life and the lives of your family and their family are in danger if you don't come clean. And what do you do here? Well, in terms of virtue, we might say that virtue ethics doesn't do a great job with this question. And maybe we can look at how virtue could apply, and we will. But virtue, like I said in the previous lecture, assumes at least some level of privilege. And if you are in a position of sheltering dissidents in your home, you are probably not one of the most privileged people in that society. And so this might even be a knock against virtue ethics to say, look, not everybody gets the chance to sit quietly in their chair and think about what is best in life and how I can be the most virtuous person so that I can bring honors upon myself. Maybe those things are fine, but if everybody can't practice them, then there's a hole in that theory. Trying to remain in virtue ethics, though, let's say you want to practice the virtue of truthfulness. Well, there's golden means, right? There's the excess and there's the deficiency. And an excess of truthfulness might be to turn this person in because you are telling too much truth and someone's going to get hurt. Then again, you could say it's a deficiency of truthfulness because my family might be hurt. But at that point, you're starting to weigh lives against each other. And I think that might actually push you into consequentialism. Does virtue ethics itself actually have to lead down rabbit trails to other forms of ethics? Maybe in situations like this. Then what if you're practicing a different virtue? What if you're practicing the virtue of right anger, something you might call righteous indignation? Well, you would have every right to be angry at a totalitarian state hunting down dissidents, how'd you get that person in your home? Probably by practicing the virtue of right anger. And so to continue to practice it well, it might be that your continued quiet rebellion is necessary. So there's a way that virtue ethics could be positive. Moving on to deontology, I think this is probably one of the better questions for deontology because it shows how there are, like with Dr. King, there's these higher obligations that we can point to. Say you're religious, you could say, well, I have a higher obligation to God, and I believe that he is above this totalitarian state and justice will be done, and I want to participate in it. Consequences be damned. That's an answer, and a strong one. Then again, maybe you practice deontology in a way where you believe that the morality of the state is all there is. We might say that some of the people that Dr. King was calling out were operating in such a framework. Then if we think about consequentialism, we can think, well, what's the highest good to the highest number of people? And it's actually a little unclear here when we consider the idea of risk. We don't know for certain that if you refuse to turn this person in, if you refuse to come clean, that your family and your friend's family are going to be harmed. It's a risk that they will be. But at that point, are you weighing risk versus reward in terms of the highest good to the highest number? How do you know that you would be treated fairly anyway? Again, what is the highest good to the highest number? Maybe just remaining as we are and hoping for the best. Or is there a third way? What if you just run away? Couldn't that be the highest good to the highest number of people? So what do you do here? Well, it's a little unclear. I'm going to guess that if you were practicing the hedonist form of ethics, unless you really enjoy sticking it to the man, you probably wouldn't have taken this person in the first place. But maybe you did. And so if you're operating in terms of hedonism, does it feel good to rebel against evil authorities? Yeah, probably. And so you'd want to continue doing that, provided that the potential of pain for being caught was not too high. Care ethics becomes more interesting here because there's more than one moral agent in any story, right? And so how would you practice care ethics here? Well, you're operating in a community. And who are the moral agents that need to be considered and listened to? Well, you have yourself, you have your own family, you have your friend, you have your friend's family, you have the person you're sheltering. Shouldn't they be conferred with? And how do their own moral considerations of themselves and you affect the decision? And I think that might be an excellent way to approach things. I'm more and more impressed by care ethics the more I think about it. Moving on to number 2. So this one is more of a scientific question, and so is number 3. So let's pretend for a minute that you're a surgeon and a patient with 5 viable transplant organs who has a slim chance of life comes to your operating table. And you know that if you operate immediately on them, they have a chance to live, but it's small. I don't want to get into specific numbers. But if you choose not to operate on them, if you choose not to save this person and take that risk, you know that you could transplant these organs into 5 other people who have a much higher chance of living. So do you operate on the one person or the 5? And where does virtue come into this? Well, if I want to be a virtuous surgeon, what do I do here? And maybe this is a good place to talk about how some of Aristotle's virtues are not quite in line with our own. He's got right ambition and magnanimity as part of his virtues. And right ambition, you want to achieve, you want to excel in the world. And so maybe your sense of right ambition would push you to choose the 5 because you can be a surgeon that saved 5 people. But is that worth condemning another person to death? Is your own ambition worth that? I don't know. I suppose you'd have to ask somebody who's a little stronger in virtue ethics. But, this question of, well, what if I value justice? What if that's another virtue? And if you value that, you might say, well, does this one person not have a right to life? How does their family feel? Are they the only provider for 8 or 9 children? Are they a particularly virtuous person themselves? What about the virtues of the five? Can I weigh those against each other? And again, I wonder if that still pushes us into other forms of ethics that virtue is not ready for on its own. It doesn't mean that it's not good to practice. It just means that maybe there's a limit to virtue ethics. And Aristotle, because of his privilege, didn't quite get there, and neither did the people who came after him. Aquinas too lived a pretty insulated life, and there's nothing wrong with virtue. It's just maybe it's got a limit. Thinking about deontology, what are my highest moral obligations here? And do you have a moral obligation to life? Do you have a moral obligation to the life of the five or the one? Yeah. And depending on where you rank your obligations, you might make different decisions. You would probably say that you don't want to consider your own ambition if you're operating in terms of deontology, because your duty to your own ambition is probably not higher than your duty to your neighbor. And then we might say, in a deontological sense, if we value life and someone's chance at living to be incredibly high, well, then maybe these five people need to wait on the transplant list a little longer because this one guy has a chance and you want to give him a fighting chance. Thinking in terms of consequentialism. Sip of water. This seems like an easy question on its head, right? If you're thinking in consequentialist ethics, you want to do the greatest good to the greatest number, cause the least harm to the least number. And so it's, the one versus the five, right? If you've ever looked at the trolley problem, maybe this becomes easier here. You want to save five people and sacrifice one, and I'm sorry, it sucks. You have to say that to their family, but I can save five people here. But in real life, this would get a lot more complicated, right? Because again, I mentioned it earlier, what if this person is the breadwinner? What if they have people who really care about them? And that's going to matter because there are more people that are harmed and helped than just the six people, seven including yourself, involved in this scenario, right? I think care ethics really excels in this one because you could say, okay, so we have how many people, how many people of moral consideration do we have here, and how many moral agents? More than you'd think, right? We have the seven, which is ourselves, and the six people who might be operated on, and then we also have their families. And so, do we gather people together? Do we start to consider as a group how we can move forward? Maybe if you're one of those five, you're not comfortable taking an organ from somebody who might be able to live. Maybe you're considerably older and this person is considerably younger. A lot of these decisions have to be made right now in terms of who gets a ventilator, in different hospital rooms for COVID. And it's not an easy question to ask, but I do think that maybe care ethics, allowing people to practice, kindness with each other, to say, no, I want you to try and save that guy. I can wait. That might be incredibly helpful. Third one, and the last one. So we're going to pretend that you are a scientist and you accidentally discover a deadly weapon while doing scientific research under contract with the government. Now, technically, all your findings are the property of that government, but you're a little worried that this research will cause great harm. So, what do you do? Do you lie and hide and or destroy your findings? Or do you turn them in and leave the moral decisions to other people? Starting with virtue. So we might come back to our virtue of truthfulness, which has come up in a lot of these because 2 out of 3 of these questions involve lying. And you could say, well, I want to practice truthfulness, and other people's virtue decisions are not necessarily my own. And so I'm going to be truthful and I'm going to turn in this research. You might also say, hey, I'm practicing right ambition by turning this in because I'm going to get more contracts, which means I can continue to, excel in greatness in the sciences rather. So those are some virtue considerations you could make. practicing virtue the other way, you might say, well, I value peace. Peace is a virtue for me, and I do not want to practice war by turning in something that might harm someone else. So that's another option in terms of virtue. Then if we think in terms of deontology, well, like with our other two questions, it becomes a weighing of obligations. Certainly you signed a contract and you're under obligation to honor the work that you were paid to do, but is that the highest obligation you have? And for some, it might be, and that's okay. Maybe that's your system and you value order and you want to follow the rules, and yeah, sure. But there might be others who want to say, I've got a higher obligation to my neighbor here, and I cannot allow them to be harmed by something that I might have created. We think about people who worked on the Manhattan Project, and what came down between them was there were people who said, this thing we've created, nuclear weapons are, they're horrible, but they were used twice and haven't been used since. They acted as a perfect deterrent against war. The moral considerations we made, it actually helped people. Others who worked on that same project became advocates for denuclearization because they saw the thing they created, realized they'd done wrong, they had violated their own moral principles, and wanted to make sure that those things were never used. And so they wanted them to be destroyed. So that's two different sides of deontology there. Then we have, consequentialist ethics here. We could say, okay, the consequences aren't really mine to decide. I'm going to punt. I'm going to turn in my research because the immediate consequences are that I'd be fired for destroying my research and probably blacklisted. And I don't want that to happen to me. I've got a career. You might also look at it and say, hey, the consequences of this are that a lot of people will get hurt, and I don't like those consequences, so I'm going to destroy my research. It's all about how you approach the question and what do you value? What is a good outcome here? And what do you risk by turning things in, and what is your responsibility in terms of good outcomes? So I don't know. I can't provide answers to you here. Then thinking in terms of care ethics, this becomes a difficult question for care ethics because there are so many unknown moral agents involved. Because in this scenario, right, it's just you that knows about the discovery you've made. So who do you share it with? Do you share this knowledge that this thing exists with the people who might be harmed by it? Well, how do you reach out to them? Or do you have to kind of make your own scenario in which you are pretending to speak with them? Who do you trust to bring it to? There's a lot of questions that care ethics would need to ask that a hypothetical situation, yeah, I mean, we could make things up, but these hypotheticals might not be able to answer. And does that mean that care ethics is wrong? Well, no, because in a real world scenario, you would have lots of people who are perfect for moral consideration. So what I want you to do is I want you to pick one of these three questions, and I'm going to post them in the Canvas page for this discussion. And I want you to give an answer. What do you do in any one of these scenarios? Explain which form of ethics you're operating in. You can operate in all of them, none of them. You can reject your morality and substitute another. Yeah, but I want you to also comment to a peer, explain if and how you might agree or disagree with them. Please be kind. If you disagree a lot, one of the best ways to do that is to ask a lot of kind questions. Remember that these are hypotheticals and not real world situations. And so something that might seem like a clean answer that gets you an A on this is not always the correct answer, because real life has many more considerations than we do in our 25-word question here. All that said, I think this is going to be a pretty good discussion. It's a way for us to try and practice these things. And I'm going to be in the comments for those. I would hope that we post these things a little bit before they're due so that we can have time to have a fair amount of discussion on them. So if you have the time, post it early so that we, meaning myself and you and other members of the class, can kind of go back and forth on it to help each other pull better ideas out. What else do you need to do? Well, we've got 3 readings for next week. None are from our textbook, and so what I want you to do is find those on Canvas. They are on the Canvas page for next week. There's links to all of them. They're PDFs. They're 3 pretty interesting readings. We have the Leon Kass one here, The Wisdom of Repugnance, which deals in the question of cloning. And I find Kass to be both interesting and frustrating because in some ways I think he's right on the money, and in others I think he's just dead wrong. So that'll be fun to discuss. I'll probably spend a fair amount of time on that in the next video. Then we have Ruth Benedict, A Defense of Ethical Relativism, also a very good piece. And then the next one is Peter Singer, Animal Liberation. Several of you have expressed a lot of questions about animal rights in our comments, in both sections of this class, really. And so I'm going to spend a fair amount of time on that, probably in lecture 5. There is also a quiz that is due at the end of the first week of Module 2. And that's the quiz for Module 1. I'm going to try and get that up early so that you have more time with it. These quizzes are not designed to hurt you or to be difficult. They're not challenges. They're to make sure you're following along. So all of the quiz questions will be coming out of the readings. So, keep your book on you. It's open book. It's open note. And with that, I'm going to end here. I'm going to hope that no dogs jump on the desk right before I end. And thank you for following along with me. And I hope you all are having a good day. And I look forward to hearing from you. Have a good day.